She found the message at 3 in the morning, and she read it 4 times. Not because she didn't understand it, but because understanding it was the problem. He was her employer. She was the woman who cleaned his apartment, made his coffee, and never once let herself want anything she couldn't afford. And yet there it was, 7 words on a screen, sent by a man who had never called her by her first name, not once in 3 months. What do you do when the person you've been pretending not to feel anything for stops pretending first? This is the story of Veronica and Dax, and I promise you, by the time it ends, you'll understand exactly why she read it 4 times. Before we begin, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now let's go. She read it 4 times, not because the words were complicated, they weren't, just 7 of them, but because each time her eyes reached the end, something in her chest refused to let go. She set her phone face down on the nightstand, stared at the ceiling of her tiny apartment in Mapogu, and told herself it meant nothing. She was good at that, telling herself things meant nothing. She'd had years of practice. But sleep didn't come, and by morning, she still hadn't replied. Veronica Floyd had been cleaning other people's homes since she was 23. Not because she lacked ambition. Her worn-out administration textbooks stacked beside her bed could testify to that. But because ambition without money moves slowly, and rent in soul does not. She worked for Hana Residential Services, one of the city's premium agencies, the kind that placed domestic staff in high-rises where the monthly maintenance fee alone cost more than her yearly salary. She was punctual, invisible, and professional. She took pride in all 3. Penthouse 31A at Hanam the Hill had been her assignment for 11 weeks. The unit was enormous and aggressively impersonal. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River, custom furniture in shades of stone and charcoal, a kitchen that looked like it had never been used for anything warmer than reheating coffee. No photographs, no art that felt chosen rather than installed. The only anomaly was a single glass, old, slightly clouded, the kind you don't buy, the kind you keep, sitting always in the same spot on the living room windowsill. Veronica never touched it. She didn't know why. It just felt like it wasn't hers to move. She knew the owner's name before she met him. Dax Patton, 34, American, Director of Regional Operations for Meridian Health Asia, a private hospital network headquartered in Gangnam. She'd read his profile in the agency file the way she read all her clients' profiles, quickly, professionally, retaining only what was relevant. She was not prepared for the man himself. He was tall in a way that filled a room without trying. Dark hair, jaw like something carved rather than grown, eyes that processed everything with a quietness that most people mistook for coldness. He wasn't cold. Veronica figured that out in the first week, though she couldn't have explained how. It was the way he said thank you when she left his dry cleaning on the chair, not as a reflex, but as if he actually meant it, and was slightly surprised by his own sincerity. Their interactions were minimal and correct. He left a typed list of preferences on the kitchen counter her first day. She followed them. He paid through the agency, on time, without comment. Weeks passed in a rhythm of parallel lives. Him arriving late from meetings that seemed to span every time zone, her finishing before he returned, leaving the apartment spotless and herself unseen. Then she started leaving the coffee warm. She couldn't explain that either. She told herself it was professional courtesy, that it cost nothing, that it was the same thing she'd do for any client. But she chose the blend carefully. She learned he preferred it dark, no sugar. She noticed when he switched mugs. And every morning, the carafe was empty. Neither of them mentioned it, not once. Until the Thursday she forgot he was home, and he saw her sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor, textbook open, pen between her teeth, completely lost in a world that had nothing to do with his apartment. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, then walked quietly to his office and closed the door. That night, at 3 a.m. Seoul time, from a hotel room in Tokyo, he opened the agency's internal messaging system and typed 7 words. "Tell me this isn't just me." He almost deleted it. His thumb hovered. Then he set the phone face down on the nightstand, the same way she would, 4 time zones away, 17 minutes later. And neither of them slept. Next time, he comes home. And the apartment feels different, in a way he can't file into any report. He came back from Tokyo on a Wednesday, which was not his usual day, and Veronica was still there when he walked through the door. She heard the elevator before she heard him, that quiet mechanical exhale of the doors parting. And she had exactly 3 seconds to decide whether to keep scrubbing the stovetop or turn around. She kept scrubbing. It felt safer. His footsteps crossed the entryway, paused near the kitchen, and she felt the exact moment his eyes landed on her, the way you feel a change in temperature. Not dramatic, just real. "You're still here," he said. Not an accusation, not quite a question. "Finishing the oven range," she replied, without turning. "I'll be out in 10 minutes. He didn't move. She could feel him standing there, jacket over one arm, probably exhausted in that contained way he carried exhaustion, like it was a document he hadn't filed yet. Then he set his bag down, loosened his tie, and moved toward the refrigerator as if she hadn't disrupted anything. She told herself that was good, professional, normal. What she didn't tell herself was that she'd noticed the tie. Dark navy, slightly crooked. She noticed it the way she noticed the coffee mug he always chose on bad days, the plain white one, never the glass. And she hated that she had a catalog of these things, stored somewhere in her chest she hadn't consented to keeping. Dax poured water, drank half of it standing at the counter, and looked out at the Han River through the wide glass wall. The city was gray that afternoon, the kind of soul gray that isn't ugly, just honest. He was thinking about the message. He'd thought about it on the flight back, somewhere over the Yellow Sea, with the kind of clarity that altitude and sleeplessness sometimes force on a person. He hadn't sent anything like that in years. He wasn't sure he'd ever sent anything like that. He was a man who measured words the way engineers measured load-bearing walls, carefully, because the wrong calculation brings the whole thing down. And yet, 7 words, sent, not deleted. She still hadn't replied. He didn't ask about it. He wouldn't. But when she finally turned to pack her supplies and their eyes met across the kitchen, briefly, the way eyes meet when both people are pretending they weren't already looking, something shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. The air in the room felt 2 degrees warmer than it had a moment before, and neither of them reached for a logical explanation. "The coffee was good this morning," he said, just as she was zipping her bag. It was the first time he'd mentioned it, in 11 weeks. Veronica looked up. His expression was neutral, but his eyes weren't quite. There was something in them that didn't belong in a professional exchange, something careful and unfinished, like a sentence he'd started and decided to leave open. "I'm glad," she said. Simple, steady, the way she said most things. She left before the silence could become something neither of them was ready to name. But on the subway home, packed between strangers in the Mapogu evening rush, she pressed her back against the metal pole and stared at the dark tunnel window, and thought about the way he'd said it. Not the coffee was good, the way he'd said it. Like he meant something else entirely. Like the coffee was just the only safe word he had. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it until she got home. It was a message from the agency. Routine. Nothing from him. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or not. That Friday, he left something on the counter that wasn't on any list she'd ever been given. And it changed the temperature of everything. It was a book. That was what he'd left. Not a note, not an instruction, not anything that belonged in the professional language they'd built between them over 3 months. Just a book, set flat on the kitchen counter where she usually found his weekly preferences list, with no explanation attached. The cover was worn at the corners. This wasn't something bought recently or chosen quickly. It was a copy of a Korean translation of a management classic she recognized immediately, except someone had written in the margins. Dense, small handwriting in English, filling every available white space. She stood there with her cleaning caddy still in her hand and stared at it for a long moment before she understood what she was looking at. It was his, not a gift copy, his personal copy. And it was left open to a chapter on organizational decision-making, but the margin note beside one underlined paragraph said simply, in his handwriting, "Wrong. People are never this predictable." She didn't touch it. She cleaned around it the way she cleaned around the glass on the windowsill, with deliberate, careful distance. But she read every margin note within eyeline while she worked. She couldn't help it. It was like finding a door cracked open in a house where every room had always been sealed shut. Dax had left it intentionally. He knew that, sitting in his office on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Health Tower in Gangnam, trying to focus on a budget reconciliation that kept blurring at the edges. He'd seen her textbooks. He'd seen her studying. He'd made a decision, small, deniable, the kind of thing a person could walk back if needed, to leave something that acknowledged her without requiring either of them to say anything out loud. He was good at controlled gestures. He'd been performing them his entire career. What he hadn't accounted for was how much it would bother him not knowing her reaction. By Thursday, the book was still on the counter. She hadn't moved it. But when he came home that evening and walked into the kitchen, he noticed something he hadn't expected. A yellow sticky note pressed to the inside front cover, in handwriting that was neat and slightly hurried. It said, "The margin note on page 47 is right, but I think you already knew that." No signature. She didn't need one. He stood in the kitchen for a full minute, alone, reading it twice. Then he set the book back down exactly where it had been and allowed himself, just briefly, just privately, something close to a smile. It wasn't the reaction of a man managing a professional situation. It was the reaction of someone who hadn't been seen clearly in a very long time and had just been seen. They didn't discuss it when she arrived Friday morning, but the air between them had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. He made coffee, which he never did when she was there, and left a cup on the counter beside her supplies, without a word. She drank it while she worked, standing at the window, watching the Han River catch the early light, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that he'd remembered exactly how she took it. Dark. No sugar. Her roommate, Jisoo, had noticed something different about her lately. A quietness that wasn't sad, more like someone listening for a sound just at the edge of hearing. Veronica had said it was just the new assignment running longer than expected. Jisoo had looked at her the way only someone who has known you for years can look at someone. Like she was reading a page Veronica thought she'd hidden. She didn't push, but she didn't look away either. That same evening, Dax had a dinner he couldn't cancel. A table at Jungsik in Gangnam, client-facing, quarterly obligation. He sat across from people who spoke loudly about markets and margins and said nothing real for 2 hours. And somewhere between the second course and the third, he found himself calculating, without meaning to, whether she would still be at the apartment when he got back. She wouldn't be. She never stayed past 6. He ordered dessert anyway. He wasn't hungry. He just wasn't ready to walk into a quiet apartment and confirm it. What came next, neither of them planned, but the agency saw it before they did. The photo came from Minjung. That was the part that stung the most. Not a stranger, not some anonymous account, but Minjung, from the agency's group chat, who had sent it with the kind of casual cruelty that hides behind the word just, as in, just thought you should know. The image was from a Korean business news site, time-stamped 2 nights ago. A corporate dinner in Tokyo. Dax in a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who don't think about cost, standing beside a woman who was the kind of beautiful that rooms notice immediately. The caption named her Sina Yu, co-director of Meridian Health's new Seoul expansion. The article called them a powerful duo. Minjung's message beneath the photo said only, "Didn't you say he was single? Also, did you know they were engaged? Like, before?" Veronica read it on her lunch break, sitting on a low wall outside a convenience store in Mapogu, eating a triangle kimbap she barely tasted. She looked at the photo for a long time, not with jealousy. She told herself that clearly and firmly, the way she told herself most inconvenient things. She looked at it the way you look at something that rearranges a room you thought you understood. Sena Yu was elegant, poised, the kind of woman who made sense beside a man like Dax Patton. Everything about them in that photo was coordinated. Their heights, their posture, the way they both faced the camera with the same practiced ease of people who belonged in photographs. Veronica tucked her phone into her jacket and finished her kimbap and went back to work. She cleaned the penthouse that afternoon with the same precision she always did. Baseboards, window tracks, the stovetop, and she did not leave the coffee warm. She told herself it was because she'd run short on time. She was almost convincing. Dax noticed. Not the coffee specifically, or not only that. He noticed the absence of her in a way that had become physical, like pressure dropping before a storm. The apartment was immaculate and completely, efficiently empty of anything personal. And he stood in the kitchen that evening, holding a mug of coffee he'd made himself for the second time in a week, and understood, without being able to explain it logically, that something had changed. He ran through his calendar, his messages, nothing obvious, but something in the quality of the silence was different. It had an edge now, where before it had just been quiet. He thought about Sena. The Tokyo dinner had been a board obligation, nothing more. 3 years since their engagement ended, and whatever remained between them was purely structural, professional, the kind of history that doesn't disappear, but loses its heat entirely. He hadn't thought about it as something requiring explanation. It hadn't occurred to him that it might matter to anyone in his life outside of a boardroom. The realization that it might, that there was someone whose opinion of him had quietly become something he tracked without meaning to, landed in his chest with more weight than he expected. He didn't reach for his phone. He sat with it instead, the way his therapist back in Nashville had once suggested he try, before he stopped going. Sitting with things was not his strongest skill. Friday morning, Veronica arrived exactly on time. She was professional, pleasant, and perfectly correct in every interaction. She answered his brief hello with a brief good morning, and moved through the apartment with her usual efficiency. Dax watched her from the hallway for a moment. The straight line of her shoulders, the way she tucked her hair back before she started working, a gesture so habitual she probably didn't know she did it. And he made a decision. "Miss Floyd," he said from across the room. She turned, expression neutral, waiting. He opened his mouth and then closed it. What he'd planned to say, something measured, something that didn't give too much away, dissolved entirely when she looked at him. There was something behind her eyes that she was working hard to keep level, and he recognized it with uncomfortable precision because he'd spent the better part of his adult life doing the exact same thing. "Never mind," he said. "Have a good weekend." She nodded once and went back to work. He left for the office 12 minutes earlier than usual and spent the entire elevator ride down telling himself he was fine with how that had gone. He was not fine with how that had gone. By Monday, he had made a decision, and this time, he wasn't going to walk it back. He was there when she arrived. That was the first thing that was different. Not rushing out with his jacket half on, not already gone with a typed note on the counter. Present, deliberately, sitting at the kitchen island with 2 cups of coffee already poured, his laptop closed for once, like a man who had cleared his schedule for a reason he wasn't going to pretend was accidental. Veronica stopped just inside the entryway. Her bag strap was still on her shoulder. She took in the scene with the quiet efficiency she applied to everything, and something in her chest performed a small, involuntary tightening that she absolutely did not acknowledge. "You don't have to clean today," he said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, a carefulness, like someone carrying something fragile across an uneven floor. "I called the agency, told them I needed the schedule adjusted." "You called the agency," she repeated. "I wanted to talk to you." Without, he gestured slightly at the space between them, at the invisible architecture of their arrangement. All of this in the way. She should have said she preferred to keep things professional. She'd rehearsed something close to that on the subway. But she set her bag down instead, crossed the kitchen, and sat across from him at the island, and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup he'd left for her, dark, no sugar, and waited. He told her about Senna plainly and without performance. 3 years ago. A relationship that had made sense on paper and nowhere else, ending quietly by mutual agreement before it could become something neither of them could undo. He wasn't explaining himself exactly. He was specific about that, his tone carrying no apology. He just wanted her to have the actual information instead of whatever a caption had decided to offer. When he finished, the apartment was very quiet, and the morning light off the Han River was doing something unreasonably beautiful to the stone countertops between them. Veronica looked at him for a long moment. "Why does it matter what I think?" she asked. Not combatively, genuinely. "Because it does," he said. Simple, irrefutable. The most honest 4 words he'd probably spoken in months. Something loosened in her then. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. She told him about the photo, about Min Jung's message. She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to say hard things, keeping her voice even. And she admitted, only once and without embellishment, that it had affected her more than it should have. She watched something move through his expression when she said that. Not satisfaction, nothing as uncomplicated as that. Relief, maybe. The specific relief of a person who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. He reached across the counter and covered her hand with his. Just that. No words attached. His hand was warm and certain, and she looked down at it, and then up at him, and the distance between them, which had been measured in professional courtesy for 3 months, collapsed into something neither of them had a procedural language for. The first kiss happened without announcement. She was saying something about the view, about how she'd always noticed it but never felt like it was hers to look at. And he leaned across the space between them and found her mouth with a gentleness that didn't match the intensity in his eyes. She went still for 1 breath, and then her hand turned under his and held on. He kissed her like someone finally saying the thing they'd been rewriting for months. Careful at first, then not careful at all. When they finally separated, her forehead dropped against his, and they stayed there, breathing the same air, the city enormous and indifferent below them. And she thought distantly that she had never in her life felt so precisely located. Like she had coordinates now. Like she knew exactly where she was. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, with a focus so quiet it made her chest ache. And she let him. And the morning stretched around them soft and unhurried. And for once, neither of them moved to fill the silence. But outside that apartment, the world had not adjusted its schedule to match theirs. And something was already in motion that neither of them had seen coming. The transfer request had been approved on Thursday morning. Veronica had submitted it quietly, told only Jisoo, who had held her hand across their small kitchen table, and said nothing. Because some decisions don't need commentary, they just need a witness. She was at the bus stop 2 blocks from Hanam the Hill at 11:17 that same night when the rain started. Seoul autumn rain doesn't announce itself. It arrives fine and cold and sideways, the kind that soaks through before you realize it's serious. She stood under the narrow shelter and told herself she was fine. She was almost convincing. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps too deliberate for the rhythm of the street. And then he was there, no coat, dress shirt already darkening at the shoulders, hair catching the rain like he hadn't noticed or hadn't cared. He'd run, she could tell by the way his chest was moving. But he'd steadied himself before he reached her. That was so entirely him that something in her chest cracked open quietly. He stood beside her and looked at the street. She looked at the street. The 2 other people at the stop studied their phones with sudden, intense concentration. Then, low and unhurried, like a word he'd been holding for 3 months, waiting for the right moment, he said her name. Veronica. Nothing else attached. No argument, no case being made. Just her name, in his voice, like it meant something he hadn't found another word for yet. She turned. He was already looking at her, really looking, and every careful, sensible reason she'd built dissolved the way only the truth dissolves things. Clean, complete, irreversible. "You don't do things like this," she said, running after people in the rain. "No," he agreed. "I don't." He reached up and brushed the rain from her cheek with his thumb, slowly, like he had all the time in the world. "I've spent a long time doing things that are like me. I'm trying something different." She looked at him, this man who filed everything, who measured every word, who had learned how she took her coffee without ever asking, who had left a book open to a margin note that said, "People are never this predictable," and then proved it completely. "I'm not transferring," she said. Not impulsively. She'd decided it the moment she heard her name in his voice, and she knew herself well enough to know the difference between a feeling and a decision. "I'm not staying because of what this could be. I'm staying because of what it already is." Something in his face went quiet and open in a way she'd never seen before. He pulled her close with a certainty that had nothing measured about it, just warm and real in the cold soul rain, and kissed her the way the whole story had been building toward. Unhurried, honest. His hands framing her face like she was something worth being careful with. When they finally separated, she laughed, small and surprised, the kind of laugh that escapes before you can decide whether to let it. And he smiled against her temple and held on. The bus came and went without either of them noticing. If this story moved you, drop a number from 1 to 10 in the comments. That's how we know these voices are worth telling. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for staying until the rain stopped. We'll see you in the next one.